Hi there. A couple of years ago, I wrote a blog post called 10 Novels That Have Influenced Me, and I thought it would be fun to turn this into a little video. Now, since I wrote that post, I've added a couple more, and I'm now calling it 12 Novels That Have Inspired Me. They're novels that I've enjoyed enough to be memorable, novels that have made me think, and novels that have influenced the way that I write. Now, since putting this list together, I've thought of even more, but I think 12 is enough for now. I've listed them in chronological order of when I read them as far as I can remember. I thought it was quite an interesting exercise. So, I hope you enjoy my list. So, as we're going in chronological order, my first book is, of course, a children's book, and the classic The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. A beautiful fantasy world, talking animals, four ordinary children who become heroes, and a magnificent, wise golden lion. What's not to like for a sensitive child of 8? This book captured my imagination like no other children's book, and I swallowed up the rest of the Chronicles of Narnia with absolute joy. I still read them from time to time. These books instilled in me the values of noble causes, courage and compassion, and deepened my love of animals. But how I wished they could talk, like the animals of Narnia. It also led me to write my own children's fantasy many years later, The Light of Drumbar. This image is of the copy I've had since I first read it, and you can probably see that it's been well used. My second children's novel is Simon by Rosemary Sutcliffe. This was the first historical novel I ever read, and while I can't remember now the exact story, except that it was about two friends who end up on different sides in the English Civil War, I remember that it captured my imagination and took me into the Civil War with thrilling, page-turning drama. Sutcliffe was an amazing writer. It was actually my headmistress who recommended it to me. She was a wise woman, because I was having trouble with history at school and she thought it might spark my interest in the past. She was right. Although I never took history at O or A levels, it sat there at the back of my consciousness as an inspiration for the recreation of the past that I would begin to work on later in my life as a genealogist and historical writer. Well, what can I say about this classic of children's and adult literature? I had read and loved The Hobbit, and then I probably first read The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien in my early teens, and I was enthralled by this epic fantasy of the defeat of evil against all odds. It again appealed to that adventurous side of me that wants to be the hero in my own story. I have read this around 5 times, which is no mean feat. And each time I am amazed and touched by the beauty of some of the prose. If you've only seen the films, which are of course excellent, and I watch them as a treat every couple of years, I do also highly recommend that you read the books so you can enjoy some of the extraordinary writing, which of course you cannot get from the films. As well as the main adventure, it is a story very much about friendship and comradeship, something that is important in my own life and is also often a part of my own writing. Sadly, my own copy of Lord of the Rings fell to pieces a few years ago, but this picture is the same cover as the one I had. And here is Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. It's another much-read book. And it's an American edition because I bought it in America. When my father went to the States with the Royal Shakespeare Company in 1975, my mother and I were lucky enough to go with him. And we were there for 4 months in Washington, D.C. and New York. Someone, I think it might have been one of the actors, suggested I read this to get a picture of some of America's history, and I'm really glad they did. I could not put it down. And the ending of the story left me inconsolable. I mean, really. I was just 14 and it was the first time I'd read a sad ending and I cried for days. When I wrote my own historical novel, I slightly modelled my eponymous heroine, Isabel Bright, on Scarlett O'Hara in her ability to survive and get what she wants, although my character is a lot less ruthless. It's also one of my favourite films, and it's an amazing achievement of a film considering that it was made in 1939. My next book is The Source by James A. Michener. I don't have my own copy of this, as my brother recommended this to me when I was still a teenager, and it was his copy. Now, my brother does not read fiction that often, but when he does, he reads really good stuff. I was blown away by this novel, and it was the first time I had read a novel that moved around in time. It is the story of an archaeological dig, and as well as the story of the two archaeologists at the dig, it also, with each artefact it uncovers, tells the history of the Jewish people. And at each find, we go back in history and follow characters from that time period. Amazing read. And this must have stayed at the back of my mind for years, as I've loved multi-timeline novels ever since, and it is now mainly the type of novel that I write. Now, I had to choose a Charles Dickens novel because he is a huge influence in my writing, especially when I'm writing stories set in the Victorian period. However, I couldn't choose them all, so it was difficult to decide which one to put here. I've chosen Nicholas Nickleby because of the chapters involving the theatre, which were useful for my novel Isabel Bright, and I also used it for my dissertation on 19th century popular entertainment for my Open University degree. I'm placing it here, though I really can't say exactly when I read it, and it represents all of Dickens' novels, all of which I have read at some time or another. Now, why do I love Dickens so much? Mostly his exquisitely defined characters, his social commentary, and his wonderful descriptions of place, which are so beautifully written and give you a real sense of Victorian London and other places. Now, while the Victorian style of writing can be a little long-winded for the modern reader, it is worth dipping into Dickens and just adjusting your mindset to this different style. And then you can immerse yourself in these incredibly rich and dramatic stories that did so much to change social attitudes for the better. Acre. Here's the story of how I first came to read Philippa Gregory. When I was in my 20s, I did a lot of secretarial temping while I was trying to find work as an actress. For 2 weeks, I worked as a receptionist for Penguin Books, and one of the perks was free books from the pulp file, which were unsold books left over from the print run. Obviously, Gregory was not as popular then as she is now. And this was when I picked up my copy of Acre. Oh my! Truly, I could not put this book down. 18th century sex, incest and murder, and a heroine who will stop at nothing to inherit the house she loves. I've since read really bad reviews of this, and I won't go back to it in case I find it's not as good as I thought it was when I read it. But I have loved much of Philippa Gregory's more recent historical novels, and this was one of her early novels that I have never forgotten. Next on the list is The Light Years by Elizabeth Jane Howard. And this is actually the first in the Cazalet quartet of novels, set mostly during World War II, and I probably read them almost without stopping in my 30s. I learned a lot from Howard's writing. She had the amazing ability to write a page turner without there being a clear plot line. And she did this by creating complex, interesting and realistic characters, all of whom grab your attention and interest. You become involved in each character's own story, and above all, you care about what happens to them. These books are a masterclass in the character-led novel, and I would recommend them to any writer who wants to improve their ability to create interesting characters. The Time Traveller's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger. Now, I read this around the time that I was formulating the idea of my first published novel, Out of Time. I was a little dubious about my plotline and whether it would work or would be too odd or quirky. And then I read The Time Traveller's Wife, and I realised that if she could write a best-selling novel about a man who travels in time throughout his own lifetime, then I could write a novel about a man who has lived without ageing for 200 years. It is an extraordinary story, and I am not only eternally grateful to Niffenegger for giving me the confidence to go ahead with my own idea, but also my sister-in-law Sharon for giving me the book in the first place. And next is A Special Relationship by Douglas Kennedy. This was the first Douglas Kennedy novel I read, and I have enjoyed all of them since. But I've listed this as being the one that really got me hooked on this writer. Psychological thrillers may not seem to be my normal genre, but I do read very widely, and Kennedy's novels really grab me. Kennedy is the master of the slow build-up of tension. He puts his main characters through the mill, and just when you're thinking things can't get any worse, they usually do. But the endings are usually highly satisfying. Any writer who wants to create an atmosphere of menace or threat whilst keeping the reader guessing what will happen for pages and pages and keep them turning, read Douglas Kennedy. The Lollipop Shoes by Joanne Harris. I read Harris's best-known novel, Chocolat, at around the same time as the film came out, and I loved both. And it led me on to read several more of her novels. And of all the ones I've read, The Lollipop Shoes is my favourite. It's the sequel to Chocolat, with Vianne Rocher as the main character, and her daughter Anouk, and a second daughter, Rosette. It has the same light touch of magic, which I absolutely love. But its underlying atmosphere is slightly darker than Chocolat, and I think that's why I prefer it. I do like my chocolate dark. And last, but by no means least, The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. I was first introduced to the amazing science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin when I read her children's trilogy, The Wizard of Earthsea. I loved that book, but I did not read her again until many years later when I was taking a course in fantasy and science fiction literature at Coursera. This book was on the book list, and I was completely blown away by the writing and by the depth of exploration into its main themes, that is, loyalty and betrayal and sex and gender, and what society would be like if you took away the differences of gender. It may be a novel very much of the 60s, and it's obviously by a feminist writer, but it is an incredible work of imagination, and it made me think, which all good books should do. Well, there's 12 novels for you, but there are still more books that I've really enjoyed and been inspired by. How could I forget Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks, one of the most moving books I have ever read? Or Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy? Or Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice? Or the Poldark books? or Mervyn Peake's Titus Grown fantasy trilogy, or Bram Stoker's Dracula. Well, it looks as though I'll have to make another list. So I'll certainly be doing another one very soon. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed my list. Please feel free to add your comments and your own favourites below. I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.